How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. For Christmas, I got an unexpected gift. For myself. From the world of the wild imaginary West. And just like Ralphie's unexpected Christmas present, this air rifle is liable to put an eye out if I'm not careful. But it has no BBs or CO2 installed, so rest assured that while I work on it, it has no way of firing. The little cartridges that came with the rifle are how you load the BBs, which I think is pretty clever. In thinking about my wild imaginary West, I wanted to explore what a rifle from this universe would feel like at a 1-to-1 scale. How would it function, what features would it have, and so on. So I purchased this lever-action cowboy air rifle, and I'm going to be customizing it today. I'm not going to do anything to block the loading port or mechanics because I want it to remain a working air rifle. All additions will be added to open areas. I was recently sent a care package with tons of these amazing little bits from a patron named Jared Dunn. I'm not sure what the pieces are or what their original intended use was, but they're going to be living new lives as antennas and greeblies in the wild imaginary West. Thanks again for all of these little bits, Jared. I also recently got some new LEDs after a comment suggesting I get some meteor shower rain LEDs, so I will be using those for this build. I'll of course also be using a lot of tiny metal pipe pieces from K&S Precision Metals. The frame of this first custom part is made from a sprue piece that I had that was exactly the right size to fit the side of the rifle opposite the loading port. I cleaned that up by snipping off the branches and filing it down till I had a nice smooth surface all around. Once that was ready to work with, I cut up some 040 styrene to build up the walls of the piece, then I trimmed and sanded the edges and kept adding pieces of styrene till the whole thing was boxed in. In universe, this little box houses a heartbeat sensor and a remote that can control larger equipment from a distance, most often paired with a forestall, which is still on the hunter's horse, wagon, or mech. But it could be paired with any equipment that's too large for the hunter to carry around themselves. Before adding the front wall, I grabbed the dimensions of the LEDs and I sketched those out evenly spaced and centered on the piece of styrene. I then took my piece of styrene over to my drill press, or rather I brought my drill press over to my piece of styrene and I used it to make 4 precise holes. I then scored lines from circle to circle before snapping out the interior shapes. And then I filed the LED-shaped windows smooth, and I added a piece of brass mesh to go behind the cutouts. After that, I glued the front on, and the structure of the box was complete. I used one of those pieces that I got from Jared that looked like it would be perfect for a little antenna to go on this box. To make it easier to connect to the box, I found an appropriately sized piece of styrene tubing, and I put that inside. After drilling a pilot hole and widening it with my X-Acto blade, I glued the antenna in place. I greeblied up the rest of the little box using model kit pieces, other bits of styrene, metal tube pieces, and to make the part look like it was connected securely, I added some tiny nuts that were glued onto little styrene rods. Once those were in place, the first part of this build was done, and the next step was to add a power supply to the stock. Luckily for me, this is faux wood and hollow, so after removing 2 screws, I was able to slide it completely free from the rest of the rifle. The butt of the rifle is also removable, as that is where the little tanks of CO2 are installed. Luckily, the whole plastic piece at the back can also be taken out, which greatly benefits the ease of adding batteries. For the base shape of the faux battery, I'm using this blank cover plate. It looks pretty boring right now, but I'm going to be sprucing it up a bit. After drilling some holes to mount it, I cut up some foam from an air filter that will help pad the plate and blend the flat edges into the curve of the stock. With the foam and the cover plate temporarily screwed in place, I began the customizations. I decided not to use the actual battery housing as I wanted to keep the profile of the battery thin so as not to impact the way it would sit against a shoulder. I opted to hide the actual batteries inside the stock. After cutting out another piece of 040 styrene, I added some holes in alignment with the holes on the cover plate. I used the pilot hole X-Acto method to get 2 holes of the size that I wanted, and then I traced out a shape of a generic sci-fi battery pack onto the styrene, which I popped out using methods that I learned from Adam Savage. I was happy with the shape and the fit, so I cut out more of that brass wire mesh and I glued it to the styrene. I added a tiny strip of styrene around the edges to make sure that it would sit flush against the cover plate. Because this thing is going to be wired up to the rest of the features of the build, I drilled some holes in the plate and then I reinforced them with some styrene tubing. Conveniently, that plastic piece from the stock had a nice area that I could attach a real battery housing to without interfering with the ability to change out the CO2 cartridges, which left me with a nice battery housing that was easily accessible. I ran the functioning wires through the stock and connected them to the battery housing using a connector for easy removal later on. After I had soldered everything and insulated the connections, I screwed everything back together and I tested my circuit before moving on. You know what they say, a tested circuit in time saves 9. I added a few more details to the fake battery and I glued it all together, and after that, it was time to move on to the switch. I wanted to position the switch where it would be functional and easily accessible, within reach at a moment's notice without having to take your hand out of a firing position. This is a monster hunting weapon after all, and every moment and second in the wild imaginary West counts. After screwing the switch in place, I soldered up the LEDs. I went with one red and one green. I dry fit them into position, and I was very happy to see that they fit snugly, so I set them aside for a minute while I primed the rest of the pieces. I masked off the brass bits that I wanted to maintain that nice metal color. Once everything had been primed, I peeled off the masking tape and I began screwing the pieces in place. I connected the battery to the switch and then the switch to the lights, and I tested the setup. And I have to say that the motion of these lights is very satisfying. Thanks for the tip, friend. Next, it was time to add some overstated red wires, which in universe serve a purpose, but for us, they are just for cosmetics. In universe, these wires carry electricity all the way up to the front of the weapon where they supply power to an electrified bayonet, which is what I'm going to make now. I didn't have a bayonet lying around, nor did I want to use an actual sharp knife for this, so I decided to kit bash one from a paint roller handle. I heated the metal using a heat gun until it had softened to plastic enough to be removed. And then I added some holes for the plastic cable clamps that will hold the bayonet onto the magazine later. After clipping off these little red ears, I shaped a small piece of basswood to create a bolster, which I cut off camera on my bandsaw and then sanded to a smooth finish. For my nice dull but sharp looking blade, I of course used some 040 styrene. I cut up 3 layers of the stuff and I traced out and shaped them into a clip point blade style, styled after a K-bar, which is not necessarily the standard bayonet style of the time, but the goal was jerry-rigged, not standard issue. I shaped the buns of this styrene sandwich with the appropriate grooves, and then I welded it all together with a full coat of plastic cement. I did some final sanding and shaping and cleanup, and then I attached the handle using some rods mounted on the end. Because this is a prop, I don't mind it being flimsy. After adding some connection points for the wiring, I took this bad boy outside and I primed it. And while that dries, I'll be prepping some fabric details. I used this painter's drop cloth because it had a nice texture and plastic laminated to one side, which I figured would help keep the fabric from fraying too much after being cut. I'm not sure if my hypothesis is correct, but I think it worked. After slicing a piece of cloth into a nice long strip, I broke out some burnt umber oil wash and I weathered the fabric in blotches. I then left that to dry and moved on to some other fun details. I suppose now you can consider this a props and cosplay channel, because for the first time ever, I'm using EVA foam. I used my Dremel with the sanding drum to shape the foam into a nice large monster tooth. Not necessarily the largest monster or most impressive hunt of this monster hunter's career, but maybe it's from his first hunt, or a reminder of a really close call. I coated the foam with UV resin, and then I carved an arrowhead which I embedded a little green crystal into. The indigenous hunters make these crystals from pine sap and plants that can sedate the monsters until the crystals dissolve. This arrowhead was a gift from a native warrior and fellow monster hunter. After painting up the tooth and the arrowhead, I tied them together using some twine. It's common for monster hunters to decorate their weapons with little trinkets like these. Unique weapons are quite a big deal in the wild imaginary West, after all. After those were done, I painted and weathered the K-bar using some sponging, chipping, and airbrushing, followed by a burnt oil umber wash. I did say that exactly how I intended. With all of the individual elements figured out, it was time for final assembly. I screwed those cable clamps into the bayonet in 3 different places and ran more of that bright red oversized wiring. Once the wires were cut, I used some smaller cable clamps to run them securely back to the battery. I used a file to scuff up the clean black edges of the rifle and reveal the metal underneath. I also used the side of a paintbrush covered in gunmetal paint over the plastic pieces that had been painted black. I then gave the whole thing some weathering using a dusty color from the airbrush and some strategically placed spots of oil wash before wrapping strips of cloth in 3 places along the rifle. The last thing to do before this rifle was ready for the Wild Imaginary West was to glue those trinkets in place. After that, I called it good. The prompt voted on by my patrons for our last art challenge was unexpected Christmas presents. Before my final shots, please enjoy this gallery of the work that they all submitted. Big thank you to all of the patrons who participated. I'm still working on some fun things involving the Wild Imaginary West outside of YouTube, and I'm very excited to tell you more about it soon. This universe is just getting started. Stay tuned. That is it for this video and for 2023. It's been a great year. I hope you've all enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome new year, everyone. I'll see you next time.